So what should be the whole of the law?
Love is the law, love under will.
Thank you guys for coming. This is Psychology of Thelema. This is part 2 of a two-part lecture. First part was last week. I'm going to very briefly go over what we went over last week, so because it leads into what we're going to talk about tonight. I know that there was a lot of great feedback and discussion during the last class. I was telling some people earlier that we didn't get through all the material that I had hoped, so I think I may be going at slightly quicker pace, not entertaining as much discussion. That being said, please do raise your hand if you have a question. I can see you a lot better this time, probably because of the lamp, and I very much enjoy comments and questions. Shall we get started?
Yes.
So a summary of what's happened. Basically, we're trying to look at Thelema from a psychological perspective. What that means is not that we say Thelema, and specifically the Book of the Law, is only speaking at the level of psychology, but we're approaching it as if that is the most important aspect for tonight. So, in particular, the Book of the Law and Thelema is full of things called metaphysical claims. You might call them that. Similar to many philosophies and religions. In this approach, we treat metaphysical claims as if they are referring to mental phenomena or psychic phenomena. When I say psychic, tonight at least, I mean basically the word psyche in adjective form. So pertaining to the psyche. I do not mean killing goats of mind bullets. Okay? So in this perspective, we basically view any kind of claim as referring somehow to our experience or the structure of our mind, the structure of our psyche in some kind of way. To give you an example, we have the figure of infinite space called Nuit. Excuse me. Now, Nuit can represent literally infinite space around us. Or Nuit can be a symbol for a mental phenomenon, namely the field of experience itself, so everything that you experience out there, or the possibilities of experience. The point is that it refers to something in your phenomenological experience, or it points to some kind of nature of your mind, your experience, the psyche, that kind of thing. Okay. So the basic symbolic worldview of what's going on in Thelema is that each individual is a star amidst infinite possibilities. Okay, so each person is the center of their own universe, and their job is to actualize their own potential within the sphere of their potentiality around them.
Just making sure it's recording.
Okay. So one psychologist that we looked at was Carl Ransom Rogers, who has my favorite middle name of any psychologist. And he has a lot of ideas that are very resonant, in my opinion, with Thelemic ideals. Carl Rogers is famous for being one of the progenitors of the humanistic psychology movement. Like I said last time, whenever you hear a therapist as being one of those people that sits back and says, "Oh, and how does that make you feel?" That's his fault. Okay? He was that influential that basically our notion of therapy essentially comes from him. And I'm willing to debate that with any psychologists that are watching. So he says this. He has something, I believe it's 19 propositions, and it's found in an appendix of a 500-page book called Client-Centered Therapy. So I imagine it's not too easy to find, but if you find it, it's really awesome. The very first proposition of his worldview is that all individuals, which he calls organisms, exist in a continually changing world of experience, a phenomenal field, of which they are the center. This is basically the Thelemic point of view as well. So you exist as a star, as a point of awareness, within a constantly shifting field of phenomena, which is this right here. And you are always experienced as the center of that world, or of that phenomenal field. So then we talked about the centrality of will in this worldview of Thelema. Thelema, of course, means will in Greek. But the point is that each individual, each organism, each star has a unique will, which is to say a unique nature, a unique set of potentials, that their purpose is essentially to actualize that potential, to actualize their organism. Now the modus operandi, the mode of operating, the way in which Thelemites do things, can be understood in this three-word phrase, love under will. So love under will is what Thelemites do, or it's what we understand humans to do. And we saw that love under will is essentially equated in many ways by Crowley with the assimilation of experience, the assimilation of possibilities within the phenomenal field, you might say, in accordance with will, which is to say, you experience things that fulfill your nature. You strive to experience things that fulfill your nature. Your duty is essentially to choose your experiences that fulfill instead of thwart your nature. To give a very, very simple explanation, suppose you are, someone attacks you in a street and you have a gun. Theoretically, like someone who's trying to kill you, you would attack them, try to save your own life, right? You want to fulfill your own potential, presumably living longer than a few seconds is a prerequisite to that. So you will choose the course of action that leads to more potential. A more subtle version might be a relationship that you have with someone else. The way in which you relate to others may thwart your nature and their nature, such as if you are an asshole, or you can fulfill your nature, by being what we colloquially call a good person. These are very, very abstract examples. The point is that we choose the way that we fulfill or thwart our nature, that we fulfill our life and our potential or not. Oops. So, love under will has two results, success or failure. It's not always that simple, but theoretically we can kind of parse it out this way. These terms and quotations are from Carl Rogers' 19 Propositions. So he says that in any experience that you have, you either have psychological adjustment or psychological maladjustment. Psychological adjustment means that you can integrate that experience into your self-structure. Maladjustment means that you can't integrate that experience into your self-structure, at least without distorting it or denying it in some way. The classic example would be some kind of traumatic experience that you can't fully grasp, you can't even talk about it coherently, you can't integrate it into your sense of self. It has to be distorted or denied. Another example is when you do something really embarrassing, right? And you look back and you really wish you didn't say that, or you really wish you didn't do that. And so you twist it and I meant to do it that way, or something like that. That would be maladjustment. You're twisting reality so that you can accept it. So successful love under will basically means meeting reality as it is and finding that way to interact with it that fulfills your nature, your potential, or your will. Carl Rogers has a term, the self-actualizing tendency, which is essentially equatable with at least a certain definition of Crowley's idea of will. Carl Rogers says that the organism or the individual has one basic tendency and striving: to actualize, maintain, and enhance the experiencing organism. I'm not sure why he listed three things after saying there's one, but I believe he's trying to get at the same idea with different words, that we're trying to actualize our potential, and that all organisms strive toward that. It's a somewhat radical proposition insofar as biologically we believe that all organisms strive towards survival. This is saying something different than that we actually strive toward more than just not dying. We strive to actualize our potential. In many ways, it is actually identical with Friedrich Nietzsche's idea of the will to power, insofar as our basic tendency is to strive toward more power. Power and potential are the same word. Potentia, they essentially mean the same thing, the various potencies or powers that are latent within us. And so I believe that Nietzsche did not mean simply that we just want to beat the crap out of weaker people around us. That's not what will to power means. It means to strive to actualize the potential within us, to assert oneself in the world that may look like normal power relations, or it may not. Either way, according to Rogers, we have this one tendency, which is to actualize our potential. Thelema has a very, very similar idea that we simply just call will or love under will. So then we talked about, how do you will? The Book of the Law talks about something called pure will, and it has certain conditions. We talked about it being unassuaged of purpose and delivered from the lust of result. This was taken to mean three things. Unassuaged of purpose means A, without regard to purpose, and B, with tireless energy. So, without regard to purpose, this means kind of mental formations or verbal articulations of what it is we are supposed to be doing. So we are not constrained by these notions of you should do this, you should not do that, except insofar as you should fulfill your will and you should not thwart your will. It basically comes down to you determining what it is that fulfills or thwarts you in any instance. But we don't set up these a priori ideals of what is and is not good or purpose. We'll actually talk about this in more depth right after I get through this summary. Unassuaged of purpose also means with tireless energy, which basically means to do things with purpose, with energy, with direction, with intention. Finally, will should be delivered from the lust of result, which essentially means that one does things without lust of the result thereof, which is me just repeating that sentence in a different way. So the way we took it was essentially not being attached to what comes of the things you do. To do art for art's sake, to do things for their own sake, not for the gain that you will get from them. So we started to talk about things that get in the way of will. One of these is morality or sin. So the very simple philosophy that Thelema has is, I believe, essentially moral relativism, where good and bad have no absolute meaning. They only make sense in relation to your particular situation. So Crowley writes that it's no longer possible to say a priori or in principle that a given action is wrong. Each man has the right and an absolute right to accomplish his true will, which is to say, we can't say that any particular action is in itself bad, simply based on principle. Of course, there are practical arguments where, in general, it's good to eat food and to sleep and to do these normal things. Of course, these are very practical ways of understanding things. But in principle, no one thing is absolutely in all cases good, and the same for absolutely in all cases evil. If you want some examples of what absolute pronouncements sound like, you can look to the Ten Commandments that were literally written in stone, according to the myth. So things like do not kill, do not steal, these kinds of things are absolute or a priori moral pronouncements. Instead of abiding by these kinds of pronouncements in themselves, we are given the responsibility and the task to figure out for ourselves what works for us and what does not work for us. And things that work for us may not work later in life, and vice versa. So it is a continual task to find what it is we value and how it is to achieve those things or acquire those things that we value. So this is kind of a glib statement. Morality, especially sexual morality, inhibits will. By morality, I mean an absolute form of morality. X is good always, Y is always bad. Sexual morality here refers specifically to a kind of Victorian morality where we police people for their gender and sexual identity, their sexual orientation, and the way in which they identify. Those kinds of things just don't really make much sense anymore in this new eon. We say that each person should love as they will, when, where, and with whom they will. And and the will there, as we talked about, means, at the very least, in a way that fulfills both parties' natures, if it is only both in that case. And the most practical way in which that is manifested is through consent. So basically, do whatever it is that fulfills you as long as it's consensual. It's easy enough, right? So that was 2 hours of lecture in about 15 minutes. Any questions before I go on to the next lecture? So aside from will being beyond these notions of purpose, this attachment to results, and also being beyond our typical absolutist kind of morality, it also the will itself, each of our wills, transcends reason. So throughout this lecture, I will refer to the mind, thought, and reason. There are a million definitions of mind. Okay, here we are talking about the kind of rational, discursive, verbal mind, the one that says words in your head and puts words to things. The mind, as a term, can simply refer to consciousness itself. There can be big mind, little mind, all these kinds of definitions. In this, we're talking in Kabbalistic terminology of the Ruach, and in normal person terminology, just our rational mind. Okay? So, just thinking about things in terms of words and logic. Right? So, in the normal functioning of daily life, our mind and reason, they obviously play very, very crucial parts. Thelema does not deny the usefulness of the mind, but seeks to put it in its right place. So in the West, reason has held a very central position, at least since Socrates and the kind of ancient Greek philosophers that elevated reason as essentially the road to truth. And in fact, reason itself was equated with God in many ways, insofar as people began translating logos as reason, and implying that our reason is essentially God itself. Or God is rational, which is silly, but I won't get into that. He definitely is not, or she. So, throughout our Western history, there were a ton of kind of checks to this idea that reason is the way to get to truth, and we can reason everything out. Of course, Immanuel Kant had his Critique of Pure Reason, among the other things he wrote, that showed various limitations of the mind. There was Friedrich Nietzsche. There was so many philosophers going in so many different time periods that it would be impossible to list. But over time, people began to see that reason had its limitations. Obviously, it could solve some pretty important problems, but it could not solve all problems. So this sort of check to the dominance of reason, this idea that reason can solve all our problems, reason is the royal road to truth, Thelema acknowledges a limitation to that there is a point at which it becomes not useful. Specifically, reason, or the mind's dominance over your will, is questioned. So, the Book of the Law says, "There is a great danger in me, for who doth not understand these runes shall make a great miss. He shall fall down into the pit called because, and he shall perish with the dogs of reason." Which I think is a great image of someone who's doing their will, and then they start to question themselves, and they fall into the pit that's called because. right? They're asking, oh, why are you acting the way you are? Like, well, because, and you start to justify yourself, and you fall into this pit where there are these wild dogs of reason that tear you apart, and presumably it's not much fun. Okay, so a curse upon because and his kin. May because be accursed forever. If will stops and cries why, invoking because, then will stops and does not. If power asks why, then is power weakness. Also, reason is a lie, for there is a factor infinite and unknown, and all their words are skew-wise. Okay, so we have this kind of image of a pit of because, where are the dogs of reason. If power asks why, we fall into this pit, or we stop. Painting this picture, this kind of symbolic picture of our view of reason. So, again, Thelema does not deny the practical necessity of reason. For example, I know that cups are used to hold liquid. I know that lights can illuminate things. I know these things, and I can use these facts with my logic and reason to navigate the world. That being said, we have to find the place for reason that's the most effective relationship to our will, to our emotion. I apologize for the length of this quote, but it's important. So Crowley says, we must not suppose for an instant that the book of the law is opposed to reason. That's weird, because it totally says that right there. But on the contrary, its own claim to authority rests upon reason, and nothing else. It disdains the arts of the orator, which is to say, rhetoric. I believe he's referring to just convincing people with rhetoric. The book makes reason the autocrat of the mind. Okay, so reason rules the mind. But the very fact emphasizes that the mind should attend to its own business and not transgress its limits. It should be a perfect machine, an apparatus for representing the universe accurately and impartially to its master. The self, the will, and its apprehension should be utterly beyond it. So the mind has a place, but it is to kind of represent the world to its master, to the self. Like I said, oh, that's a cup. It's probably used to hold liquid. It's a table. You can set objects on it. That's a person. You should probably not set objects on that. And so on and so forth. Yeah.
Blake, yeah. I was just going to ask, do you think it would be fair to say that when he's saying that the book of the law isn't opposed to reason, even though he just said that, the last sentence does seem like the summary of why that is, but do you think it would be accurate to say that it's, another way of phrasing it might be that it's also rational to accept the paradox that something can be abstract, and in that sense you can't use reason to understand it, and so that in itself is reasonable?
It is. That's essentially what I'm doing right now, is using reason to establish that reason has its own reasonable limitations. So basically I'm doing what it is you're saying right there.
There's another thing, then. Mankind is a rational being.
Is a rational or is an irrational being?
There's the paradox.
Yeah. Yeah, so I believe, what is it, Aristotle or something said something like that. I personally disagree, probably because I'm a psychologist. But people are not very rational. Have we looked at the polls lately? Just kidding. I don't know, I'll leave. Sorry. So there are these ideas. There's because, there's reason, and there's why. These are even capitalized in the Book of the Law. They're all attacked in some form by the speaker of the book. The idea being that if you ask why you should will something or why you should do something, it cripples the will, or it cripples your power. The simplest analogy I can think of is, if I'm sure many of you play instruments. If you're playing an instrument and you start to think about it, it is the quickest way to start to mess up. Okay? Or even, for example, to fall in love. You start to ask why it is that you fall in love, and you ask the reasons that you love a certain person. You start to analyze something and essentially kill it with your mind by making it very concrete and rational and basically dead. the idea is that it's the thing itself, it's the will itself, the motion, and to stop that motion, to stop that natural outgrowth or that natural experience, kind of unnecessarily with the reason, is an inhibition to your full potential.
So there is something you can kill with mind, though it's just optics.
Yeah, there you go. Okay, so Crowley, I'm just going to go quick through this part actually. So Crowley says there is no reason why a star should continue in its orbit. Let her rip. So you can imagine a star in an orbit traveling this course. Why is it traveling that way? Of course, you can analyze that and give all these formulas and so on and so forth. In the end, you can basically say, because that's the way it's going. A plant is growing in this fashion because it's a plant, which basically gives you no information. There is no essential reason, a verbal articulation, that justifies these things happening. They can describe it in a way, but they don't give the reason for it happening. They don't give the justification for it happening. In a similar way, he writes, it's ridiculous to ask a dog why it barks, presumably because it doesn't speak English, but also because one must fulfill one's true nature. One must do one's will. To question this is to destroy confidence and to so create an inhibition. He's giving all these examples. Another quote that's not in here is something like, do what thou wilt is to bid stars to shine, vines to bear grapes, rivers to run, and so on and so forth. It is for things to fulfill their nature in the most fulfilling way possible. So here, now we get into psychological language. He says, every time the conscious acts, and presumably he means the conscious mind, it interferes with the subconscious. It is the voice of a man and not of a god. Any man who listens to reason ceases to be a revolutionary. He kind of equates revolutionary thoughts, revolutionary purposes with this lack of inhibition. You have to kind of throw yourself out there to be a revolutionary, take some risks. If you listen to reason, and you're reasonable, chances are you will be not that revolutionary. So Carl Jung, he says something that's amazingly similar to what I'm saying, and it'll probably start to make sense now that we hear it in normal language and not highly cryptic symbolic language of the Book of the Law. So Carl Jung, in his psychological commentary on The Secret of the Golden Flower, which by the way was the original inspiration for this entire lecture, I encourage you to read it. The intellect does indeed do harm to the soul, and soul means psyche to Jung. The intellect does indeed do harm to the soul when it dares to possess itself of the heritage of the spirit. It is in no way fitted to do this, for spirit is something higher than intellect, since it embraces the latter and includes the feelings as well. So he gives kind of a hierarchy of things here where there's spirit and mind. It's a very similar idea to the idea of neshama and then the ruach. And a part cannot encompass the whole is a very simple idea that he's essentially saying there. Carl Jung says somewhere else, this is a completely different place where he talks about a very similar idea. He says, rationalistic opinions come unexpectedly close to neurotic symptoms, which is, I can't tell if that's a joke or just a statement. It's funny though. Like these, they consist of distorted thinking, which takes the place of psychologically correct thinking. The latter kind of thinking, which is to say psychologically correct thinking, always retains its connection with the heart, with the depths of the psyche, the taproot. Okay, so the idea is that rationalistic opinions is kind of the superficial way of moving about the world. They have no real connection to the psyche, the core of the psyche, the heart, if you want to be kind of romantic about it. So these are opinions based solely on reason, rationalistic opinions. This is exactly the kind of purpose, the why, because, and stuff that's attacked in the Book of the Law. have one more quote. This is from Stefan Heuler. So he is a very interesting character. He does some kind of Gnostic commentaries on Jung. Very interesting stuff if you're into that. But he says this. He says, thinking, the function of reason, has many commendable uses. It's like I've been saying that all along, right? Thank you, authority, for backing me up. So, thinking has many commendable uses and cannot be eliminated. But it also builds barriers between the personality and its unconscious matrix. So between the conscious and the unconscious mind. In order to reach the necessary transformative self-knowledge, one needs to keep the thinking function subservient to the inspiration proceeding from the self. And the capital S self here refers to the Jungian archetype of self, which encompasses the whole psyche. So the same doctrine is expounded, the inspiration proceeding from the self, which contains both conscious and unconscious, is the will of the individual. And therefore, the thinking function has to be subservient to that self, or that self's will. To build barriers between the personality and the unconscious matrix, or the conscious and unconscious mind, basically creates a conflict within oneself, or a conflict in your will. And you will perish with the dogs of reason, of course. In case you wanted a more romantic kind of authority to justify all this, a saint of our Gnostic Catholic Church, William Blake, says, if the sun and moon should ever doubt, they'd immediately go out.
Well said.
Right, I mean, I could have just thrown that up and saved you guys some time. This is my favorite part of the lecture. Let's talk about individuation and the true will. Let's not put that up yet. The mind can inhibit the full expression of the will. There is a factor infinite and unknown, which Crowley, in his commentary, says the factor infinite and unknown is the subconscious will. He uses a psychological term to explain this idea. So the factor infinite and unknown is the subconscious will, and therefore, theoretically, if we can clear away these thought complexes that prevent the will from manifesting, we will come to know and do our will. This process by which we come to know and do our will is called in many places the great work. When Crowley explains this great work of coming to know your true will, so here's a very interesting case of him explaining what that means to come to know and do your true will. Pay attention to the decidedly psychological terminology that he uses. So he writes in a new comment to the Book of the Law, chapter 1, verse 8, for those that are paying attention, we are not to regard ourselves as base beings, without whose sphere is light or God. Okay? So we're not base beings where God is outside of ourselves. We all agree on that, at least? Alright, let's continue. Our minds and bodies are veils of the light within. The uninitiated person is a dark star, not to be confused with a Death Star. And the great work is for him, or her, to make his veils transparent by purifying them. This purification is really simplification. It's not that this veil is dirty, but the complexity of its folds makes it opaque. Okay, so imagine this kind of star that has these folds of ignorance or whatever around it, which makes it a dark star. The point is not that we're washing them, really. It's kind of we're simplifying all these folds, all these complexities that veil the light, our inherent light within us. So he continues, the great work therefore consists principally in the solution of complexes, which is a Jungian term, the complex, which is a constellation of psychic or ideas in your psyche. If you have a complex about your mother or something, right? We've heard this kind of terminology, hopefully. So everything in itself is perfect, but when things are muddled, they become evil. Okay, that's kind of a mystical statement. But what he's saying here is that each person is inherently divine and perfect in themselves. There are these complex folds around us, which are the veils of our kind of worldview, our ignorance, and so on. The way we come to our light is by simplifying these veils solving our complexes, which is to say resolving our complexes, and coming to that inner light without the veil of these different distortions we have in our beliefs, in our experience, and so on. Yeah.
Joe Campbell said it a little more succinctly, being transparent to the transcendent.
Being transparent to the transcendent. Okay. There you go, yeah. Make it transparent. Make those faults transparent.
Awareness and its restriction.
That too. That is also true. So this process of the great work that consists principally in the solution of complexes, I believe is coterminous with the phrase that Crowley used, which is knowledge and conversation of the holy guardian angel. Many people equate the great work itself with knowledge and conversation of the holy guardian angel, including Crowley, who writes, "The great work is the attainment of knowledge and conversation of the holy guardian angel." There are people out there that question these basic tenets, and here I am with evidence to prove them wrong. The process by which we come to know and do our will is the solution of complexes inhibiting the free and natural flow of the will. So, the theory is that if we're only able to cleanse the doors of perception, to use a William Blake phrase, we'll be allowed to manifest our pure wills more effectively. This is essentially what Crowley says when he writes, "Our own silent self, which we can consider that dark star, helpless and witless, hidden within us, will spring forth, if we have craft to loose him to the light. Spring lustily forward with his cry of battle, the word of our true wills. This is the task of the adept, to have the knowledge and conversation of his holy guardian angel, which is to say, to become aware of his nature and his purpose, fulfilling them." I would prefer, personally, if he just skipped to that second part and said what he meant, but, some people like the obscure occult language. So here, Crowley not only makes this knowledge and conversation, which you'll hear sometimes people simply say K and C, he makes it analogous to becoming aware of and fulfilling your nature and purpose. Interesting stuff. So, the various forms of Horus found in the Book of the Law, there are many forms. Can you think of any? Rahor Kuit,
Rahor Ku.
Rahor Ku, Rahor Kut, Hur Pakrat, Hur Parakrat, Hiru Pakrath, Hiru Raha. There's a lot of forms of Horus that occur in the Book of the Law. I believe it's about 8 that someone counted, not me. But I would say that Horus, in all of these forms, represents a symbolic expression of that silent self, that true self. And so, in a way, also a symbol of the holy guardian angel. Horus is therefore a archetypal expression of the self, to which all aspire to unite with, identify with. So the great work is to identify with that thing we symbolize by Horus. The great work is to identify with the self. I believe this is spoken to in the Book of the Law when Horus, who is the speaker of the 3rd chapter, says, "To me do ye reverence. To me come ye through tribulation of ordeal," which is bliss. So you revere me, and you come to me through ordeals, which are bliss. Now, wouldn't that be crazy if Crowley equated that line with some kind of psychological process? I think so. So, Crowley says, "We have seen that Rahor Kuit is in one sense the silent self in man," which I just said, a name of his Cobbs, which is to say the light, or the star. Not so as impersonal as Hadith, but the first and least untrue formulation of the ego. We are to revere this self in us, not to suppress it, not to subordinate it, nor are we to evade it, but to come to it. And this is done through tribulation of ordeal. This tribulation is experienced in the process called psychoanalysis. What? Now that official science, as if there were such a thing, has adopted, so far as its inferior intelligence permits, the methods of the magus. But the ordeal is bliss. The solution of each complex, see the same language he used before about the solution of complexes. The solution of each complex by tribulation is the spasm of joy, which is the physiological and psychological accompaniment of any relief from strain and congestion. So he basically says that we come toward the silent self that we symbolize by Horus through the process known as psychoanalysis. And the psychoanalysis involves the solution of complexes, these kind of psychic complexes within us, that when we resolve those complexes in a way through this ordeal, often in Jungian terms, this means the unconscious simply becoming conscious, and we experience that archetype in some way. What's going on here? So the point is to resolve these complexes, and in the resolution of these complexes, which often can mean simply the uprising of the unconscious contents in dreams, in our various magical experiences, in psychosis, and in various other forms, these kind of create a solution of those complexes, a release from the strain of that complex, which he calls bliss. The real important part being that he essentially equates the process of the great work with a decidedly psychological idea, psychoanalysis, and explains that in terms of another psychological process, the solution of complexes within the psyche. So if there's any question that Crowley, at least at some point, came at this from a psychological perspective, I think it's pretty indisputable that he at the very least used that language to try to explain what it is, essentially, initiation is, or attainment, yeah.
I was just going to say that it reminds me of, I think, in Liber Libre, where he says, the greater thy trial, the greater thy triumph. And that's definitely true in my experience.
Right. And passing through that ordeal, the greater that trial, the bigger the complex is resolved, theoretically.
Which is again mirrored in Nietzsche in the whole classic, that which does not kill me makes me stronger.
Yes, indeed. That was Nietzsche. Yeah.
And Jung did call it a confrontation with the unconscious, right? Not a fun playtime.
Fun playtime with the unconscious, yeah. Yeah. Yeah, of course, there's his whole notion of the shadow as being the first layer of the unconscious, and the shadow in general is not happy playtime. It's quite the opposite of that. So, speaking of Carl Jung, there's this quotation that I put in a ton of my works, in case you're following that. But it is such an amazing definition of individuation. There's so many different parts that link up to Thelema that I just can't help but quote it here and read it to you right now. So, individuation. So by the way, individuation is the process by which we become ourselves. It is basically the goal of our psyche. It's the evolution, what we're tending toward. Okay? So individuation is becoming an individual. Insofar as individuality embraces our innermost, last, and incomparable uniqueness, it also implies becoming one's own self. Okay, so the first idea is that we're becoming fully ourselves. That sounds a lot like Thelema already. We could therefore translate individuation as coming to selfhood, or self-realization. Now, egotists are called selfish, but this naturally has nothing to do with the concept of self that Jung is using here. Individuation, therefore, can only mean a process of psychological development that fulfills the individual qualities given. In other words, it's a process by which a man becomes the definite, unique being that he is. In doing so, he's not just become selfish in the ordinary sense of the word, but is merely fulfilling the peculiarity of his nature. And this is vastly different from egotism and individualism. So basically, individuation is the process by which you become that person you truly are, that you fulfill the peculiarity of your nature, which doesn't mean just the weirdness of your nature, which is true for probably most of you here, but it means the specific you that is you. that is peculiar or unique to you. Okay? So the essential idea here, I believe, is basically the same as the essential idea of coming to know and do your true will. It's to come to find what your peculiar nature is and to fulfill that nature. Jung here talks that individuation is a self-realization, but he makes sure to qualify that by saying it's not a strengthening of your ego self, so to speak. This self is realized beyond the normal kind of egocentric conceptions of self. Instead, this self, which you can imagine with a capital S, self, contains both the conscious and unconscious factors of your psyche. Both everything of which you are aware and everything of which you are not aware. The self contains both of those things. So Jung explains the conscious and the unconscious minds are not necessarily in opposition to one another, but complement on another level or something like that to form a totality, which is the self. So there's this very common image of the entire self where the self is an iceberg. The top of this iceberg is the conscious mind. The bottom of this iceberg is the unconscious mind. So Jung talks about this idea that the conscious and unconscious is very much like this is actually a Freudian idea. The conscious mind is much like the iceberg above the water, this little tip that peaks up above the water, and there's this vast substructure below the water, the unconscious, that is much bigger, but they are one iceberg. They're one thing. They're you, basically, your psyche. Now, I was talking about how this is the self to which you come to through tribulation of ordeal, this whole self. And I was talking about how Horus, this kind of falcon-headed god of Egypt, is a symbol of the self that is used at least in the Book of the Law and some other places. In some other places, the holy guardian angel basically stands in for this same symbol. Crowley writes, in case you don't believe me, the angel is the true self of his subconscious self. What? It's like, he just totally said what I was saying. So the angel is the true self of his subconscious self, the hidden life, capital L, of his physical life. And wouldn't you know it, his angel is the unity which expresses the sum of the elements of that self. The conscious and the unconscious, which complement each other to form a totality, the self. The angel is the unity which expresses the sum of the elements, so that you see these fit together so beautifully. And again, the angel is simply a symbol of that full, total, all self. So this is basically a quotation. He or she is Harpocrates, the child Horus. This is just him showing that he is in unity with his own secret nature, and he associates that with Horus. It's just another kind of supporting quotation. So one might even assert that the great work in terms of individuation of the psyche is a natural process of the human psyche, that we're all individuating, some of us kind of more shitty than others, but we're all trying to individuate. Okay, so Jung, in this essay from Volume 7 of his collected works, he says, the driving force of the unconscious, so far as it's possible for us to grasp it, seems to be, in essence, towards self-realization. It seems that the unconscious is pushing toward this in certain ways, often whether we like it or not. There's a holy book of Thelema called Liber Het, often mispronounced as Liber Cheth, where there's a line that basically says, we'll bring you to the goal whether you like it or not. It's going to happen. So I wish I had that quotation up here, but it's an idea that Jung believes in, that we're all basically going toward this end of trying to become whole. And I believe there's also some justification within Thelema in the Thelemic texts. So in this sense, all humans, all y'all, presuming that you are all humans, are participating in the drama of the great work. We're each striving consciously or unconsciously toward that union of our unconscious and conscious natures into a coherent self, so that we may more fully accomplish our wills. I would would say there is a psychological model of what it means to fail. So failure in this context really refers to this process of love under will that we were talking about earlier, which is to say each of us is the center of our own experience. We experience a world of a phenomenal field of experiences, and each of us tries to integrate these experiences. Sometimes we integrate them and we keep going. Sometimes they are too painful, too embarrassing, too whatever, to really be accepted by us. And so we deny them, pretend like they never happened, or we distort them, or whatever. Last time I mentioned this quotation from Nietzsche, where he says, my memory says that I did. My pride says that I did not. In the end, my pride wins. So that is Nietzsche giving a very clever way of explaining what we call repression. You did something that was embarrassing. Your pride says, I couldn't have done that. I'm such an awesome person. And so in the end, you basically come to the point where it's like, I couldn't have done that. Or you have some kind of silly explanation for it. Anyway, let's go to the super intense version of that occurs in the Book of the Law. So, I believe that Thelema constructs a completely practical psychological system, and it's established along somewhat familiar psychological lines. So in the body, if everything is working harmoniously, so if your body is healthy, the consciousness, your mind, your awareness continues to operate undisturbed by the various organs of your body. For example, if I said, feel your butt on your chair. Okay, now you all are aware of the pressure of your butt on the chair. You were not before because it was functioning perfectly well, and presumably all your other organs were also functioning perfectly well, and you just were not paying attention to them. Okay, so if something's working well, you don't notice it, for the most part. It is only when there's a malady of some sort, a malfunction of an organ, the skin is, say, pierced by a knife, or you experience stress or anxiety, or whatever. It's only then that your consciousness is... it's only then that your consciousness is disturbed. Wow, that was great timing. So, in a physiological sense, the body notifies consciousness of its trouble by issuing signals of pain. Okay, so the body, something's going wrong, I've been stabbed in the arm. What happens? You have these signals of pain that you experience, and it interrupts whatever you're doing, presumably. Now, take this idea and apply it to your mind, or the psyche. The Book of the Law does this, and it says, Dost thou fail? Art thou sorry? Is fear in thine heart? Where I am, these are not. The I here can be taken to mean, is obviously referring to hadith. As a kind of colloquial expression, you can take it to refer to the God within yourself. So, in the same sense that pain signals a certain failure of your body to function harmoniously, so too does sorrow and fear signal the failure of your psyche, I guess, to function harmoniously. Okay? So Crowley writes, sorrow, pain, and regret are symptoms of diseased thought. Those only who have ceased to be able to adjust themselves to perform love under will, psychological adjustment, right? Those who have ceased to adjust themselves rightly and gladly to all change and to grow thereby, or those who still react only feebly and vainly, they take sorrow, pain, and regret to be real. The idea here is, of course, that you are in reality, with a capital R, Hadith, an immortal, indestructible God. Yeah.
Is there any record of Crowley's own, dark night of the soul where he didn't take his own advice? About this?
Oh, yeah. There's,
Cat Blood Night.
in one way you could take it, okay, Yeah, there's plenty of times where he was not very happy. The first thing that springs to mind is his vision of sorrow that kind of led him to the path. The second thing that springs to mind is the death of his child. There are times that he was pretty freaking upset. The idea is not that any experience of sorrow means you are a weakling and you deserve to die. It means there is a disturbance of the psyche. So in the same way that some maladies of your body are really not your fault and you can't really do much about them, there are also things where there are plenty you can do about them. You know, if you're sticking your hand in a fire and it starts to hurt, you'll take it out. Psychologically, we keep our hand in the fire, so to speak, for a very long time. We do these things that throw us off balance without really redressing our actions. But yeah, this should not be used to shame people into being like, oh, you're sorrowful? Well, fuck you. I mean, you could do that, but suffer the consequences. So, from this kind of lofty hadith perspective, where you are identified with the infinite, with the absolute, with your Godhead, we have this pronouncement: existence is pure joy. All sorrows are but as shadows. They pass and are done, but there is that which remains. So any kind of sorrow, pain, or regret implies, practically in this sense, some kind of failure to adhere to this perspective. In another holy book of Thelema, which is Liber Tzadi, for those that are interested, it says, only if you are sorrowful, weary, or angry, or discomforted, then you may know that you have lost the golden thread, the thread wherewith I guide you to the heart of the groves of Eleusis. So this is very symbolic language, but it's basically saying essentially the same thing. If you're sorrowful, and then it adds weariness, anger, and discomfort. These are signals that you're not doing your will, basically. Okay? Especially if it is repeated, if it's chronic. Not in the sense of super dang, but you know. So these can be understood as signals from the psyche that love under will is not being performed properly, so to speak. So Crowley confirms this idea that this only happens when you mess up at love under will, when he writes this. He says, sorrow appears as a result of any unsuccessful, therefore ill-judged struggle. It's like I could have just put that quote up and without rambling at you. Acquiescence in the order of nature is the ultimate wisdom, said Lao Tzu. Crowley. So he's basically saying these are symptoms of not being in harmony with oneself and the universe. It's very much this kind of idea of a squeaky wheel, right? So if something's out of order, it'll start clunking, making noise, it'll start sending pain, it'll start sending sorrow, upset, struggle, anxiety, that kind of thing. That's a signal that something is not in line. Whew. So this very closely parallels some of Carl Rogers' propositions. So Carl Rogers has these 15th and 16th propositions. We saw that love under will is very much the same as Carl Rogers' idea of psychological adjustment earlier in the lecture. Whenever it fails, we have psychological maladjustment. So he writes, psychological maladjustment exists when the organism or the individual denies awareness of certain experiences, okay, sensory or visceral experiences, which consequently are not symbolized and organized into the gestalt of the self-structure. When this exists, there is a basic psychological tension, or potential psychological tension. I gave the example of something very embarrassing that you can't integrate it into your sense of self. You have to twist it and distort it, and so on. That's an example. You can apply that basically to all of your experience, in some degree, insofar as you do not accept it as it is. So this psychological tension that occurs when we do not integrate it is essentially a psychological way to say sorrow or suffering. Okay, so it's basically saying If experiences are not assimilated, they generate psychological tension or sorrow or suffering that can be perceived as a threat that causes the self-structure to become even more rigid and unadaptable. So sorrow, pain, regret, fear, anger, discomfort, all these negative psychological phenomena are signals of failure to perform love under will properly, which is to say, to integrate experience in a harmonious way with ourselves, with our nature. So, Rogers says, any experience which is inconsistent with the organization of the structure of the self may be perceived as a threat. And the more of these perceptions there are, the more rigidly the self-structure is organized to maintain itself. Okay, so something is perceived as a threat. That's not necessarily a physical threat. A lot of us, say, pride ourselves on our intelligence. If we get a test back that says you got an F, we say, oh my God, that means I'm stupid, right? That's a threat to my self-structure that says I'm smart. You know what? That's not possible. Okay, so what happens is you clamp down, you become more rigid in order to maintain that organization. There's no way that I'm that stupid. This test is rigged, or this, the teacher just didn't really set this up right, or it's weighted. You'll find some way to make it not true. Okay. So you can see this in the ways that whenever someone feels they are attacked or threatened in some way, they become very black and white in their thinking. This is good and that's evil. And there's no in between. And so that is a symptom of this kind of perceived threat to the self-structure. What are the various signs that we have so far? Sorrow, pain, regret, fear, anger, discomfort, and pity. Wow, that's a lot. So I'm going to totally skip past all of that. So there's a lot of stuff about how pity is essentially an unthelemic idea. That has to do with the fact that pity, as it's understood by Christians typically, and most people, involves looking down on someone. So you can imagine yourself saying to someone, I pity you. Right? That comment often comes from a kind of superior angle. You're judging them, I pity you. You can imagine your face curled up in disgust as you say that to that person. It has nothing to do with any kind of fraternal notion of aid or tolerance or anything like that. This is just another form of judging people and basically not accepting them as stars, as their own sovereign individuals in their own world. It's seen as essentially condescension, as looking down on people, whereas the ideal is to look equally to people.
Is it the difference between empathy and sympathy?
Yeah,
I feel your pain instead of, I've been there before.
Right. Yeah, it's I would say pity in this sense is, I see your pain and you're weak because of it, or something like that. And I see how you can't even deal with that pain. You're so weak. I pity you. Empathy and sympathy are I would put them personally like levels above that. But there are also very grave dangers there, especially where you project onto the person what it is they're feeling, which is to say, this happens all the time. This is like the typical colonial attitude. You guys are in so much trouble. Let me come over and help you. And of course we've seen how well that works out in foreign policy.
New country.
Wait, I said I was not going into politics.
Pretty good. Sorrow. Pretty good.
Yeah. That was somewhat uncontroversial, at least in the Bay Area. So let's go on to these more weird occult things that we can all agree on. So, has anyone who here has heard of the life and death instincts? Who here has heard of Eros and Thanatos as drives. So, okay, it's the same thing. So let's talk about these life and death instincts that are essentially Freudian concepts, but I want to show how actually Crowley preempted this in many ways. So there's this beautiful line from the Book of the Law, chapter 2, verse 26. It says, this is Hadith speaking, essentially as the Kundalini serpent within each of us. Okay, the kind of life force or divine force within each of us. It says, I am the secret serpent coiled about to spring. In my coiling there is joy. I lift up my head, and I and my nuit are one. If I droop down mine head and shoot forth venom, then is rapture of the earth, and I and the earth are one. That makes no sense at all. What the hell? Bear with me. Okay, so this symbol shows the vast potential stored within the self, like that contained within a coiled serpent, analogous to an unknowable power hidden within the recesses of your unconscious. So from this position of this coiled serpent, you can imagine a spring that's coiled and pressed in. It has this potential energy. It wants to do something. Okay, so Hadith has these two possible actions as a coiled serpent. Again, this is you. This is the God within you is Hadith. You have two options at this point of coiling, at this point of choosing experience. You can become one with Nuit, or you can become one with the earth. Okay, it's right there. Lift up your head, I and my Nuit are one. Lift down, or put down my head, shoot forth venom, I and the earth are one. So, Crowley writes in his commentary to this line, the mystic union is to be practiced with both spirit and matter. Those were old Eon gestures. Up his spirit, down his matter. Okay. So, the two types of orgia, which means the works of magic. Okay, so union, we're basically saying you should unite with spirit and matter. You should unite with heaven and earth. Okay, Nuit and earth. There are two fundamental courses to be taken: return to spirit or immersion in matter. These are the two basic kind of magical paths you can take in any choice. Now let's find the connection with our lovely friend Sigmund Freud. So Crowley writes in something called the Antecedents to Thelema, which is an unfinished essay published in the book The Revival of Magick. Antecedents of Thelema. He writes, magic equals the will to live. Mysticism is the will to die. Whoa. There's plenty of other quotations to support these ideas, but magic is generally associated with life, with manifestation and creation. Mysticism is associated with death, with love, with union, dissolution, those kinds of things. Okay? So, this brings to mind the theories of the life drive, which Freud called eros, which from whence we derive love, and specifically erotic love from eros. And the death drive, which is called Thanatos, not to be confused with Thanos, who holds the Infinity Glove. So Sigmund Freud had these ideas. This was kind of a later idea in his philosophy. But he defined the death drive as an urge inherent in all organic life to restore an earlier state of things. So it's kind of a return to an earlier, easier state. You can imagine this as becoming an infant again, when things were simple, going back into that womb, right? So that can be likened very easily to a union with Nuit, where your consciousness becomes one, and the life instinct or eros can be analogous to the rapture of earth. So we have Magick, which is the rapture of Earth, or the will to live, and this kind of mystic will to die of Thanatos. Believe me, I'll bring this all together in a minute. Yeah, what's up?
So it sounds like from this, like suicide is a good example of like there not being like an a priori, good or bad. It's like it's your will to commit suicide, for instance. You still have to deal with the repercussions of doing that, but it's a valid.
Yeah, do you?
You have to, I guess, be willing to accept the reality of what the effect it will have on others.
Right.
But it could very well for you be an expression of your will and the death drive.
Yeah.
Potentially, yeah. I think Freud would not agree with that. I think he would say it's kind of a distortion of the death drive, but we'll see, yeah.
And yet, man has the right to die when and how he wills.
Absolutely. Notice I said Freud, not Crowley. So now it's going to start to get crazy. So Carl Jung has this thing called Septem Sermonis ad Mortuos. Does anyone have any idea what I'm talking about?
Nope.
The one person, yeah. Seven sermons to the dead. Okay? There's 7 sermons to the dead. Anyone else? Now that I've said that? Okay, so man, Jung was such an amazing guy. He was such a crazy mystic, and his work is so amazing, especially in these weird esoteric manifestations that I'm about to show you. It's really great. He wanted to be seen as a scientist, and so he actually withheld many of these things until after he died. He very famously said, "Do not publish the Red Book until after he died." Many of you, I'm sure, are very familiar with the Red Book, and it's amazing kind of spiritual, alchemical text. It's great. So, yeah, this is a text, 7 Sermons to the Dead. It's very short, 7 chapters, like 20 pages or something, but it's crazy. Okay, so instead of me just telling you how crazy it is, let's read about it. This is from the text, okay? The world, this is very much like the Book of the Law. It's almost a received text that he wrote down as if someone was dictating it to him. So he writes, "The world of the gods is manifest in spirituality and sexuality. The celestial ones appear in spirituality, the earthly in sexuality. Spirituality conceiveth and embraceth, it is womanlike, and therefore we call it Mater Coelestis, the celestial mother, or the heavenly mother. Sexuality engendereth and createth, it is manlike, and therefore we call it Phallus, the earthly father." Are you guys tripping out yet? Okay, so the sexuality of man is more of earth. Sexuality of woman is more of the spirit. I will kind of ignore the kind of gender essentialism and bifurcation there. I don't think it is that dualistic. We obviously each contain male and female, each within ourselves. But this duality starts to sound a lot like the kind of thing in the Book of the Law. So these are actually psychic functions of our psyche that are autonomous insofar as we don't control them with our conscious mind. They're just going on in the background. There's one that's a celestial mother, which sounds a lot like Hadi lifting up his head to unite with Nui. And there's the earthly father, which sounds a lot like Hadi drooping his head, shooting forth venom, and uniting with the earth. Now you're getting it. It's like my 3rd one tonight. It's the first one people laughed at. Okay, so
didn't you tell me at one point that even like the circumstances in which Jung received this text were very similar to the Book of the Law as well?
Yeah, I mean, Jung actually used, I believe this was the case where Jung used the same phrase as Crowley, which is that he, at least when he was writing the Gnostic Mass, where he said he wrote it in a white heat, where he basically just wrote it front to back, real quick, and his reason did not interfere with his will at that point. Okay, so
Jung used that same expression.
I believe white heat was the particular expression. Yeah, I remember reading that and being like, "Wow, it's the exact same phrase," even though he was German. Anyway, or Austrian. So in Jungian psychology, I said this already, but in Jungian psychology, it's understood that the psyche is bigendered, in that it contains both masculine and feminine aspects. So it should be understood that the celestial mother and earthly father pertains to every man and every woman, to each of you. It's not that women have the mother and that men have the father. No, we each have both of these. Presumably, you each have a mother and father in the same way. We have not, I don't think we've gone into the technology yet to transcend that, but we will. So Jung continues in this crazy text, and he says, anytime he says man, of course, this is a translation, I believe, of the German Mann, which means person. It does not mean male. Otherwise, he would say something like Mensch. But anyway, so man shall distinguish himself both from spirituality and sexuality. He shall call spirituality mother and set her between heaven and earth. Has anyone ever seen a Gnostic Mass? Okay. He shall call sexuality phallus. Has anyone seen a Gnostic Mass? And set him between himself and earth. Okay, so we have mother spirituality, mother heaven, and father phallus. For the mother and the phallus are superhuman demons, which reveal the world of the gods. What the fuck? We have a very similar language used in the Book of the Law. And again, Jung says that we must treat all these metaphysical claims like this as referring to mental phenomena. So we can understand these things as referring to things within ourselves. Okay? Now I'll bring it all together in a convenient table form. You're welcome. So here we go. So there's hadit, which is you, the inner core of you, that's coiled. It's prepared to experience something. It's prepared to engage a course of action. Either one, to return to spirit, or two, to immerse itself into matter. We might also call this none and two. The two potential courses of will, one, return to spirit, immersion in matter, I just said that. Okay, so Book of the Law, chapter 2, verse 26, we have these two quotes. I lift up my head, I and my nuit are one. If I droop down my head, I and the earth are one. Return to spirit, immersion in matter. Let's add Crowley's commentary. Mysticism equals the will to death, or union with the spirit. Magick equals the will to life, or union with matter. Then we have Freud. He says thanatos is the death drive to return to an earlier state of simplicity. And we have Eros, the life drive. Finally, we have Carl Jung, who says the celestial mother is spirituality. The phallic father, or earthly father, is sexuality. Spirit and sex, mother and father, on, etc. That's fun, isn't that?
Yeah.
One of my few original thoughts. So, I referred to these two drives, which is to say, mother and father, phallus and celestial mother, as two drives, or autonomous psychic functions outside of your conscious functioning. And Jung wrote that you shall distinguish yourself from these, which means to separate yourself from them. What does that mean? So he goes on and he says, spirituality and sexuality are not your qualities, not things you possess and contain. They possess and contain you. For they are powerful daemons, or demons, manifestations of the gods, and therefore things which reach beyond you, existing in themselves. No man hath a spirituality unto himself, or a sexuality unto himself, but he standeth under this law of spirituality and sexuality. No man can therefore escape these demons. And I don't think that is a reference to Nemo at the end, but for those of you who understand that totally obscure reference, enjoy that. So what he's saying here is pretty crazy. He's saying that these are not things that we have. They have us. We insofar as we are ego or a personality, we are subject to them. This is in a way, a very simple idea. We could say we are subject to the law of hunger and death. They own us. Yeah, of course. In a way, it's very similar to this. We do not control these things. They are laws of our being. So they are not our qualities in the normal sense that we think of something as part of ourselves or part of our personalities. Rather, they're forces influencing our psyches. Our normal conscious self is the ego, which is informed by these two drives, these two aspects of will. So it should be remarked that no matter what it is that Hadi does, if there is coiling, if there's lifting up of the head, if there's drooping down of the head, in all cases, Hadi expresses joy and rapture. So it is an expression of the idea that existence is pure joy regardless of what happens, regardless of what choice is made, as long as it's in line with will. Yeah.
Is this table exactly the same as the one in the essay version of this lecture?
I sure hope so.
Which is conveniently available for purchase, I might add.
I think
In a book
it might be, yeah.
on yonder shelf.
Indeed. So we have half an hour left. How much more can you guys take?
2 hours.
Half an hour, maybe?
Only half an hour.
I see motions of wanting more.
Just one other quick question.
Yeah, what's up?
With Jung, like, him being aware of the concept of...
Can you speak up a little? I'm sorry.
With Jung, possibly making a veiled reference to Nemo, would he have been aware of that concept from alchemy or from, I don't know where it comes from, I just know what it is.
I don't think he would have been aware of that. So by the way, Nemo is a Latin term that means no man. Is that a hand?
Yeah, so that concept, or that basically pun, goes back at least to Greek mythology.
Oh, nice.
Defeated the Cyclops.
Oh.
Sweet. Yeah, so my reference was to this very last sentence, that no man escapeth these demons. In Thelemic, let's say theology for the fun of it, Nemo means no man, and is the name of every single person that annihilates their ego, which makes sense. You don't have a name if you annihilate your ego, so you are no man, or Nemo. So basically the whole movie Finding Nemo was really just a futile endeavor. He obviously became a master of the temple.
Is that what happened? Fell asleep.
That's what I remember. Alright, so let's talk about death. Yay! So a full psychological perspective obviously has to take into account the many facets of life, and it has to take into account the universal fact that all things are impermanent and eventually die. Sorry if that's the first time you've heard that. It might be hard news, but there you go. So Thelema asserts a perspective on the issue of death, insofar that death is viewed as the kind of climax to and fulfillment of life. Okay? So although currently psychologically and scientifically unverifiable, it's asserted in Thelema pretty consistently that there is an indestructible element of the self that survives death and views death as merely another experience. This might be equatable to a soul. It might be equatable to something like the Hindu Atman, which is to say there are not many of these things, there's simply one. I'll leave that up to you. So it was explored earlier how we talked about fear as a sign of the failure for the psyche to harmoniously function, to harmoniously integrate experience into ourselves without distorting it or denying it. Death is possibly the most universally feared idea. And in this sense, it's crucial to dispel our misperceptions about us. Now in Thelema, In Thelema, it's understood that existence is pure joy. Not only is life joyous, death is joyous as well. In fact, we have a feast for life or birth, and we have a greater feast for death. There is no other greater feast in the Book of the Law. There are many feasts. There is one greater feast, and that is for death. There's some more stuff. It says, write and find ecstasy in writing, work and be better working, thrill with the joy of life and death. Ah, thy death shall be lovely. Whoso seeth it shall be glad. Thy death shall be the seal of the promise of our age-long love. Come, lift up thine heart and rejoice. So we have a statement that says we should not only have a feast or a greater feast for death, we should thrill with the joy of both life and death. And death is... Sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. Death is not just the end, but the seal of our age-long love. The seal, the end, the thing that completes it. And so we are bidden to lift up our head, our heart, and rejoice. So death is the fulfillment of life. Let's go back to Carl Jung, who makes more sense. He says, we are so convinced that death is simply the end of a process that it does not ordinarily occur to us to conceive of death as a goal and a fulfillment. Isn't this crazy? It's just like he just says everything that Crowley said, but 30 years later. We are so... burn. Yeah. We are so convinced that death is simply the end of a process that it does not occur to us to conceive of it as a goal, as a fulfillment, as we do without hesitation the aims and purposes of youthful life in its ascendance. Jung was big on this idea that the first half of our life was about expansion and youth and trying to achieve things, and the second half of our life was essentially acceptance of death, acceptance of our dissolution. That is a huge simplification, but let's just accept that for now. It's easier. So, So we don't view death as a goal or a fulfillment. Obviously, the Book of the Law and Thelema is an exception to this. We do assert the need to view death not only as a fulfillment, but as a time when others die, as for rejoicing, for the fulfillment of their lives, of their wills.
Then against weight.
What's that?
Then against weight.
Is a book.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's about the process of dying and feasting. A greater feast for death.
I'm glad someone figured out that book. Yeah.
Huh? I'm not picking that book up either.
Okay. Yeah, I'm not going to pretend to understand that book.
Yeah.
Thelema is an exception to this. We're told to fear not at all. Fear neither men, nor fates, nor gods, nor anything. And in this way, we as Thelemites accept all facts of life, including the inevitability of death, with the same love under will, with the same, in theory at least, rejoicing. In fact, the Book of the Law says that death is the crown of all. And Crowley, because he wanted to just reword things, he said death is the end that crowns the work. So a Thelemite is, in theory, ready to accept death, the end. For they're performing their will with tireless energy, without regard to purpose that is imposed upon them, unattached to lust of result. And death will come at its proper moment, while one is doing one's will with one pointedness and peace and detachment. Death is not something to be fearful about, but something to be embraced. Okay, this is intense, but we'll get through it. So Carl Jung says, natural life, or our basic life, is the nourishing of our soul. Anyone who fails to go along with life remains suspended, stiff, and rigid in midair. You can imagine Carl Rogers' psychological maladjustment, where we become rigid when we don't harmonize with life or integrate our experiences of life. That is why so many people get wooden in old age. They look back and cling to the past with a secret fear of death in their hearts. Anyone know anyone like this? Maybe? No? Didn't think so. Okay, so they withdraw from the life process, at least psychologically, and consequently remain fixed like nostalgic pillars of salt with vivid recollections of youth, but no living relation to the present. Now does this sound like someone you know? From the middle of life onward, only he remains vitally alive who is ready to die with life. For in the secret hour of life's midday, the parabola is reversed, and death is born, right? The second half of life does not signify ascent, unfolding an increase in exuberance, but death, since the end is its goal. The negation of life's fulfillment is synonymous with refusal to accept its ending. That last sentence is pretty intense. Basically, you can't live if you refuse to die, or to accept that you will die. In case you're bored, I have a whole dissertation on this subject. Talk to me afterward. I would say that Thelema is not a system that refuses to accept life's ending. In fact, it's a great joy, life's fulfillment. And of course, I mentioned before that there is a part of oneself that is immortal. I think that's a little bit of a misnomer to say it's part of yourself. Rather, you are part of it, which is immortal, but still. This immortality is better understood as an identity that is removed from or beyond the conditions of space and time, rather than an entity that simply lives on forever throughout time. Okay? So you can imagine a soul that existed from, say, 2000 BC until forever. It just keeps going. It's a sense of self that's forever. Rather, this is a sense of self that is outside of time itself, outside of space itself, outside of duality and multiplicity. That is the immortality that at least I am talking about. So it is not the ego or the personality that transcends death. It is the impersonal life within you, within which we all live and with which we must identify. There is that which remains. Carl Jung, coming along to help us, he says, the psyche's attachment to the brain, which is to say its space-time limitation, is not necessarily as self-evident and as incontrovertible as we have hitherto been led to believe. This is kind of a controversial statement. So he actually goes on to say, there may be an element of our psyche that may attain to or belong to something beyond space-time limitation. I promise this is the last intense quote like this. The fact that we are totally unable to imagine a form of existence without space and time by no means proves that such an existence is impossible. It just means your imagination is bad, right? So, and therefore, just as we cannot draw from an appearance of space-timelessness an absolute conclusion about a space-timeless form of existence, we are not entitled to conclude from the apparent space-time quality of our perception that there's no form of existence without space and time. Okay, that's a very complicated way to say that you experience this world within the constraints of space and time. That does not mean that there is another form of existence that is not constrained by space and time. So it's not only permissible to doubt the absolute validity of space-time perception, it is, in the view of the available facts, imperative to do so. The hypothetical possibility that the psyche touches on a form of existence outside space and time presents a scientific question mark that merits serious consideration for a long time to come. Whoa. Whoa, that's crazy, Jung. I thought you were a hardline scientist.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Could that be the same thing as the higher self?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, that's a term. Higher self, yeah.
The genius.
Could be the self, the genius, the God. It matters how you parse these things and how you define them.
seems like Robert Anton Wilson was a fan of Jung and Crowley. The whole maybe logic, like you said, you have a bad imagination.
Mhm.
You can't hold that possibility in your mind.
Right, yeah. The ability to hold those possibilities is quite useful, if only to contemplate them as possible.
Was it Robert Anton Wilson, a good friend of Philip K. Dick's?
I hope so, that would be awesome.
That's cool.
So, the Book of the Law says, Yea, deem not of change, ye shall be as ye are and not other. There is none that shall be cast down or lifted up. All is ever as it was. In the sense, there is an indestructible element of the self that cannot be cast down or lifted up. We might call this hadit, that which perceives, that which endures all events, but is ultimately unaffected by them. And in that way, we can say that all sorrows are but as shadows. They pass and are done. There is that which remains. That part is what we might call the higher self, what we might call hadit, what we might call the crowned and conquering child within all of us that perceives every event, including death, as one more accretion to our experience. Fun, we're almost there. 15 minutes to get through another chapter. So, what is this, Walt Whitman? So it may be possible that there is an essence or an element of ourself that survives what we perceive to be our physical death. In fact, it does not even suffer the hurt or suffering while alive. Even so, the mere belief in such a notion, I believe, gives you the disposition to, as Jung calls, die with life. Which is to say, truly understanding this idea that there's some element of the self that survives brings a tendency to want to live life to its fullest potential. To live without fear or attachment. To try to live to the fullest expression of the self that will end in death, recognized as the seal of life's fulfillment. Occasionally I have some people up here to make it look like they said it much better than me. Well, they obviously did. It's Walt Whitman. So he says, great is life, real and mystical, wherever and whoever. Great is death. Sure as life holds all parts together, death holds all parts together. Has life much purport? Ah, death has the greatest purport, which is an old term for meaning, in case you have no idea what that means. In short, things are awesome. Now let's get really Jungian. So archetypes, okay? There are two specific archetypes that Carl Jung gives attention to that are of particular importance for Thelemites. The first of these archetypes or archetypal manifestations is that of the spark, the star, also known as the astrum or the scintilla. All of which are symbols, according to Jung, of the self. This is the point of light archetype. In every culture, among all people, this thing. A star, a scintilla, point of light. The second archetype that is very important is the night sky, which represents the unconscious in its entirety. Okay? So we might imagine all the potential of the cycle under this figure of the night sky, and this one figure of kind of the self or Godhead, the unity, as being the star or astrum. Of course, we have this line, every man and every woman is a star. If that's not enough evidence, I'll take the next 10 minutes or so to explain it to you. So, I said that was the last quotation. That would be really long. I lied to you. Carl Jung has some amazing quotations on this. I took only the shortest and most interesting out to present this to you guys. Okay? So, from Alchemy, I, meaning Jung, take first and foremost the idea of the scintilla, the sparks, which appear as visual illusions in the arcane substance. If we may compare the sparks to archetypes, it's evident that Kunrath, a 16th century alchemist, which means he lived in the 1500s, lays particular stress on one of them. This one is also described as the monad and the sun, and they both indicate God or deity. Psychologically, the one, scintilla or monad, is a symbol of the self. Okay, we're tying it all together for us. The sun, the monad, God, the star, these are the archetype of the self. These are all pointing to each other. This is a continuation of this quote. Bear with me. We'll get through it. This light is the lumen natura, the natural light, which illuminates consciousness. And the scintilla or sparks are germinal luminosities shining forth from the darkness of the unconscious. Whoever translated this was feeling poetic, from German. Dorn, who is another alchemist, like Kunrath, owes much to Paracelsus, with whom he concurs, when he supposes, now this is Latin, but it's really freaking cool, okay? So, especially in light of Thelema. So try to bear with me. So, Dorn, an alchemist, said this, invisibilum solum plurimis incognitum, in man, which is to say there is an invisible sun, unknown to many. He also said this, sol est invisibilis in omnibus, in terra vero visibilis, tamen ex uno et eodem sole sunt ambo, which is to say, now pay close attention to this, the sun is invisible in men, but visible in the world. Yet both are of one and the same sun. This is the secret of the OTO, in my opinion, and I'm going to say it publicly. I don't think it's that secret. It's secret only in the sense that you can come to experientially acknowledge this as a truth, at least as expressed in this symbolic form. This is the one sun that we keep talking about, that the Gnostic Mass is about, on and on and on. The Godhead within us, that is expressed in the Son without us. So, thus, the one archetype emphasized by Kunrath is also known to Dorn as the invisible sun, the sol invisibilis, or the image of God. In Paracelsus, this natural light comes primarily from the astrum or sidus, the star in man. Can you believe that he never read Crowley? Okay. This only proves that it is archetypal to me. That he had no idea of what Crowley was writing, and it perfectly matches up. This comes from the star in man. It said, indeed, man himself is an astrum. He's saying man is a star here. Okay. Every man and every woman is a star. This is Jung saying this. Not by himself alone, but forever and ever with all the apostles and saints. Each and every one is an astrum, the heaven a star. Therefore saith the Scripture, ye are lights of the world. So he's tying together alchemical imagery, biblical imagery, and, unbeknownst to him, Thelemic imagery, to show that these are all the same image. The light, the spark, the star within man, which is that unity expressed symbolically by the sun and other stars. Pretty cool, at least I think. I've got 8 minutes, so I'm going to just keep going. So the next one is infinite space and infinite stars thereof. The night sky, Nuit. This represents the unconscious as a totality. So this is Nuit proclaiming this of herself. Some have noticed that infinite space and infinite stars are capitalized, which spells out Isis, the infinite mother of nature and the heavenly mother. So, on this note, we can turn to Jung again, who talks about archetypes in his alchemical vision that correspond to Thelemic symbology. And he says, it strikes me as significant that the characteristic alchemical vision, so characteristic meaning many people have had this, is of sparks, scintillating in the blackness of the arcane substance, that they should, for Paracelsus, change into the spectacle of the interior firmament, or the interior heaven, and its stars. So this alchemical vision of the scintillating stars in an arcane black substance is identified with your interior world, your interior heaven, and its stars. He beholds the darksome psyche as a star-strewn night sky. This is a perfect example of taking the metaphysical claims or symbols as mental phenomena. He beholds the psyche itself as the symbol of the star-strewn night sky, whose planets and fixed constellations represent archetypes in all their light and all their divinity, their luminosity and numinosity. So the starry vault of heaven is in truth the open book of cosmic projection, in which are reflected the mythologisms or archetypes. In this vision, astrology and alchemy, two classical functionaries of psychology of the collective unconscious, join hands. So Nuit is considered the totality of the darksome psyche, with each star being an archetype therein. So Nuit becomes a double symbol in a way of both macrocosmic and microcosmic implications. On the macrocosmic scale of the universe, each individual is a unit, a star, tied together in the body of the night sky. The totality of possibilities. On the microcosmic scale of ourselves, Nuit represents the totality of each of our psyches. And the plethora of stars within this night sky of our unconscious represents the many archetypes within our unconscious. Within this night sky, there is that one scintilla, that one monad, represented by the sun, the biggest star that we have, which is a symbol of that whole or integrated self. So this section is added to show that not only do the symbols of the Book of the Law represent the manifestation of common archetypes, they also have historical precedents in various alchemical texts. Jung's work, which is On the Nature of the Psyche, for what it's worth, appeared many, many decades after the writing of the Book of the Law. I believe about 5 decades after. It's unfortunate that Jung was not aware of or didn't investigate the modern occurrence of these archetypal patterns happening. But I believe the Book of the Law can be viewed, again, as a product of, an expression of, the collective unconscious, as filtered through the very peculiar and unique psyche of Aleister Crowley. So earlier, I believe in the other lecture, I said we may find statements of universal import explained under the figure of certain symbols familiar to Crowley's consciousness. We see the universal expressed in the particular symbols that Crowley knew of in the Book of the Law. And while this is true of certain cases, such as Hur Prakrat, Hu Raha, the specifics of this, such as even the Qibla or Kaaba that show up in the Book of the Law, with Crowley's unique spelling. So also, does the Book of the Law contain universal symbols? Truly universal, the star and the night sky are two examples that I just pulled out of Jung, where he has these quotes that basically explain Thelema to us in a way. So, I wanted to give these lectures to show that Thelema and its central text, the Book of the Law, give a very valid perspective of psychology if you have the wit and the ingenium to understand what the symbols may be referring to. I personally used a lot of Carl Rogers and Sigmund Freud, Carl Jung. These are three giants in the psychological literature, at least historically. Nowadays, a lot of people would kind of scoff at them. But these are three giants in the history of psychology. Each of them had ideas that seem, at least to me, almost perfect fits to explaining certain aspects of the Book of the Law and Thelema. Hopefully I did a good job of convincing you that, at the very least, they are interesting interpretations of Thelemic ideas. Again, I did not hope to show that the Book of the Law is only something that refers to psychology, but that there is a wealth of information in approaching the Book of the Law and Thelema in general. especially the symbolism, the more esoteric ideas, as referring to mental phenomena, in that it is, to put it very simply, it is not divorced from our modern understanding of the world. In fact, it preempted a ton of these ideas, if only symbolically. So I hope that was all very interesting to you. I'm really sorry of how fast I had to go through all of this. I wanted to get through at least this archetypes part. I know a lot of people were interested in that. So I'm sorry, but I'm not sorry at all. Thank you guys for coming and listening. I really appreciate your attention. Thank you. Any comments or questions before my voice completely dies?
Just a quick comment. Wasn't Psyche's lover Eros?
Yeah, in Greek mythology, yeah. Totally.
I just think that's interesting. Because we're a sex cult now.
Right.
I was wondering if there was a way for people to donate and show their appreciation for all the hard work that goes into this stuff.
Yeah, I'll give you your $5 later. Thank you. So we do give these lectures essentially free of charge. The Magick is free. We do pay for this temple and for all these things to happen, including all this lovely technology. So please donate, even if it's just $1 or whatever else. The donation bowl is back there. We very, very much appreciate it. Yeah.
Not involving donations.
Good.
The new comment to Liberal, it's kind of two questions. First question is, where can I find that published? And the second is, the verses that are labeled there, is that like the verses of the new comment, or is that the verses of Liberal that specifically is referencing in every instance?
Okay. So the new comment is something that you can find online at hermetic.com. I hesitate to suggest that because it is totally full of typos. There are sections that are completely missing without explanation. You can find the best version in something called The Laws for All. It is an abridged version of the new comment, but it was something that actually Crowley himself told, who was it, Wilkinson or something, to edit it and abridge it. So it is something he wanted himself. Laws for All. The full unabridged version is something called the Magical and Philosophical Commentaries on the Book of the Law. It is worth about $900 right now, so good luck.
Was it published in Equinox at all?
It was not.
No,
The old comment was in the Equinox, but it is quite short. Equinox 3 or Equinox 4 or something. But the Laws for All is really what you're looking for. Hermetic.com has some of the less abridged stuff, but I really would not trust it. It's full of typos and things are missing again. Yeah.
What about the 7 sermons, the Jung one? You had mentioned within a separate, it didn't come out until after his death. Did it come in a separate thing?
I'm not exactly sure where to find that. I have a book that's standalone of it. It's just that. It's very small.
There's like a Gnostic commentary. I think we have it here somewhere.
Yeah, there's something called Gnostic Jung that has it in it. It's by Stefan Huller, who I quoted actually in the Curse Against Reason part. Huller. Also, if you just Google 7 Sermons to the Dead or Septem Sermones, I very much recommend it. In fact, there's tons of things in there that I didn't even get to that are insane. It talks about Abrasax as being the union between life and death. There's an immense amount in there that's pretty crazy, and in particular links up with our Gnostic Mass quite well, I would say. Quite well indeed. So the second part of your question was, do these refer to lines?
Like if it said if it was new comment chapter or 236 or 26, for instance, that specifically
that refers to the commentary.
Paragraph?
No, it's not. It refers to somewhere within the commentary to that line in the new comment. You'll have to find it yourself. I'm sorry.
I can find it.
Yeah, Anthony.
It's interesting in philosophy to see how will is interpreted. Schopenhauer's will is a indefeatable drive to procreate.
Right.
That we all get to fight against. It screws with all of our
plans. It constantly has us on the hunt, or it's in the back of our heads, or annoying us through our families, and it's just an indefatigable action that's external to us, and it's constantly screwing everything up. And the way it's expressed here is just, it's very comparatively free. And it's divergent from Nietzsche's version as you could think of it.
Yeah, I mean, I've actually talked about this with a particular brother here who's not physically here right now, but that in many ways Schopenhauer had a concept of will to live, or will to procreate, will to survive, that Nietzsche said, in fact, no, it's actually a will to power. That's the nature of this indefatigable will. And then Crowley came along and said, actually, the nature of will is love, the union of two things that we are striving to unite. So that's one way to look at it, that it's kind of a progression of ideas of people trying to interpret that one will that lies metaphysically behind things.
Philosophy works.
Yeah, just, make some fancy guesses and hope it works out. All right, well, thank you guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.